My name is Ingrid Thornton, and for 2 years my own parents made sure no one in my town would hire me. Not because I lacked education. Not because I had done something wrong. But because they told everyone that I was a thief. Every accounting firm, every bank, every business owner who might have considered giving me a chance. They all heard the same warning. Be careful with our daughter, my father would say. She stole money from us. It didn't matter that the accusation was twisted. In a small town, reputation spreads faster than facts. Within months, my name had become toxic. Interviews would start warmly and end awkwardly. Managers who had seemed excited about my resume suddenly changed their tone. Emails arrived days later saying the same thing. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. At first I blamed myself. Maybe my interviews weren't strong enough. Maybe my experience looked too thin. But after 15 rejections, a cold realization began creeping in. Something else was happening. And eventually I discovered exactly what it was. But to understand how everything fell apart, you need to know about my family. Sicher so gepaaren. From the outside, the Thornton family looked perfect. My father, Gerald Thornton, owned the largest construction company in our county. His name was attached to half the office buildings downtown. Our house sat on 3 acres just outside town. A polished 2-story colonial with white pillars and perfectly trimmed hedges. Inside the garage sat 3 cars, my father's Mercedes, my mother's Lexus, and my brother Marcus's brand new BMW. Marcus was 4 years older than me and had always been the golden child. While I grew up trying to prove my worth, Marcus grew up being celebrated for simply existing. My father often said Marcus would inherit the business someday. He has the instinct for leadership, Dad would tell people proudly. I rarely heard my name mentioned in those conversations. When I did, it was usually in a very different context. In Lande is uns gemessen, sichtig Befolgungen vor den Entwicklungen sichten. The differences started early. When Marcus wanted to study abroad during college, my father paid the tuition without hesitation. Experiencing the world builds character, he said while writing the check. 2 years later, I asked about the same program. My father laughed. What for? He said. You'll get married eventually. Save the money. So I attended a nearby state university instead. I commuted from home every day while working part-time to cover my own expenses. At family dinners, conversations always revolved around Marcus. His internships. His promotions. His future plans. Meanwhile, I sat quietly at the end of the table, passing dishes and clearing plates while my father delivered life advice to his son. A man builds his legacy through his work, Dad would say, pointing his fork at Marcus. He never said those words to me. Schreien zu werden. When I was 16, I overheard something that changed how I saw my place in the family forever. My parents were arguing in the kitchen. I had paused in the hallway outside the door when I heard my father say something I'll never forget. Daughters don't need achievements, he said coldly. They need husbands. He paused. Ingrid will marry well, that's her job. I stood there frozen. That was the moment I realized my father didn't see me as someone with dreams. To him, I was simply an obligation. Ich bin nicht der Ansicht so. Things truly began unraveling the summer before college. One evening my mother handed me a credit card. For necessities, she said gently. Books, supplies, whatever you need for school. My father nodded from behind his newspaper. Don't go crazy, he added. But you're covered. I took those words seriously. Over the next 3 months, I used the card only for school expenses. Textbooks. A used laptop from the campus technology store. Notebooks and accounting calculators. The total came to about $1,200. Then the statement arrived. And my father exploded. I remember standing in the dining room as he slammed the paper onto the table. Who told you that you could spend this much? He shouted. You did, I said nervously. You said it was for school supplies. I said necessities, he snapped. Not a shopping spree. My mother tried to intervene. The books were expensive this semester. Stay out of it, Diane. Then he looked back at me with icy certainty. You'll repay every dollar, he said. Or you can find somewhere else to live. Anderes tun. So I worked. 2 part-time jobs. One at the campus library. One at a coffee shop during weekends. For 8 months I worked nearly every spare hour. I kept every receipt and recorded every payment. Eventually I paid back the full $1,200. But the damage had already been done. Working so many hours meant I couldn't take a full class schedule. My 4-year degree stretched into 6. 2 extra years of commuting from home. 2 extra years of being reminded I was a burden. I believed that once the debt was repaid, things would return to normal. I was wrong. Because my father never forgot that moment. And years later he would use it to destroy my future. Die Rose, wie wird Tag ohne? The only person who ever treated me like I mattered was my grandmother. Margaret Hayes had built her own furniture business decades earlier and retired with enough money to live comfortably. She was sharp, practical, and far more observant than anyone realized. During family gatherings, I often noticed her watching my father carefully, especially when he dismissed me. One evening when I was 15, we were sitting together on her porch watching the sunset. Suddenly she reached over and took my hand. Ingrid, she said quietly. I want you to remember something. Her voice was unusually serious. I've already prepared something for your future, I frowned. Prepared what? She smiled softly. Someday you'll understand. At the time, I thought she was just being mysterious. I had no idea she was telling the truth. Because 15 years earlier, my grandmother had already set a plan in motion. A plan that would one day save me from the family that tried to destroy me. But I wouldn't discover that plan until the day I walked into the office of a powerful CEO who had been waiting for me for 15 years. And that meeting would change everything I thought I knew about my life. After graduating with my accounting degree, I believed my life was finally about to begin. 6 long years of studying, commuting, and working double shifts had finally paid off. I had the diploma, the skills, and a resume I was proud of. All I needed now was an opportunity. At first, everything seemed promising. My first interview was with a small accounting firm downtown. The manager who interviewed me, Mr. Carter, spent nearly an hour reviewing my transcript. These grades are excellent, he said with genuine interest. And your work history shows serious dedication. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. I think you'd be a great fit here. I left the office feeling hopeful. For the first time in years, I felt like my future might finally belong to me. 3 days later, I received an email. We regret to inform you that we have chosen another candidate. It was disappointing, but I tried not to take it personally. Rejections happen. I sent out more applications. Nicht an. The second interview went just as well. This time it was a regional bank looking for a junior financial analyst. The branch manager shook my hand firmly and said something that made my chest fill with relief. You remind me of myself when I started out, he said. Hard-working and determined. He told me I would hear back within the week. But again, the response came in the same cold format. We appreciate your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other applicants. The pattern continued. Interview after interview ended the same way. Managers praised my credentials. They seemed excited during the meetings. Then suddenly, after a few days, everything changed. Emails became distant. Phone calls stopped. And the position would mysteriously go to someone else. After the 10th rejection, I began to feel something I hadn't expected. Suspicion. Nagt zum Bord zum Kanan. The answer finally arrived during my 15th interview. The company was a small bookkeeping service run by an older man named Daniel Reeves. Unlike the other interviews, he didn't smile much. He asked questions carefully while flipping through my resume. Then he leaned forward and folded his hands. Ingrid, he said quietly, I'm going to ask you something directly. Have you ever been involved in financial misconduct? The question hit me like a slap. No, I said immediately. Never. He studied my face for several seconds. Then he sighed and pushed his chair back slightly. I believe you, he said. But unfortunately, that's not what I've been told. My heart started racing. Told by who? He hesitated. Then he spoke the words that made my stomach drop. Your father. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. My father? I repeated. Mr. Reeves nodded. He called me yesterday. My mind spun. Why would he call you? Because he heard you applied here, the man replied. And he wanted to warn me. The word warn echoed in my head. What exactly did he say? I asked slowly. Mr. Reeves looked uncomfortable. He said you had a history of dishonesty. My chest tightened. He told me you had taken money from the family business a few years ago. That's not true, I whispered. I know, he said gently. But Ingrid, this is a small town. He paused before continuing. When a respected businessman calls and warns you about hiring someone, people listen. The truth finally crashed down on me. All those rejections. All those polite emails. They weren't about my qualifications. They were about my father. I drove home in silence that evening. The steering wheel felt heavy in my hands as anger slowly replaced confusion. When I pulled into the driveway, my father's Mercedes was already parked in the garage. He was sitting in the living room reading the newspaper like any ordinary evening. I walked in and stood in front of him. Why are you telling people I'm a thief? I asked. He didn't even lower the paper. I'm protecting my reputation. My hands clenched into fists. You're destroying mine. He folded the newspaper slowly and looked at me with calm indifference. If people know what happened with the credit card, he said, they deserve to make their own decisions. That was 6 years ago, I replied. And I paid every dollar back. My father shrugged. Trust takes time to rebuild. His voice was completely unemotional. I'm simply being honest. Honest. The word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. You're lying, I said quietly. He leaned back in his chair. If that's how you choose to see it. Then he added something that made the room feel colder. Maybe this will motivate you to prove yourself. Es ist. That night I sat in my bedroom staring at my resume. Every line represented years of effort. Years of sacrifice. And my father had erased all of it with a few phone calls. For the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. My father didn't just underestimate me. He wanted me to fail. The realization made sleep impossible. So instead of lying awake, I began researching something else. Jobs outside of town. Cities where my father's name meant nothing. Where his influence couldn't follow me. I opened my laptop and began searching for companies hiring entry-level accountants. One listing caught my eye immediately. Mercer Holdings, Junior Financial Analyst. The company was based in Chicago. A massive investment firm managing billions in assets. The kind of place where a small-town rumor would mean absolutely nothing. I applied immediately. Then I closed my laptop and tried to forget about it. After everything that had happened, I doubted anyone would even look at my application. But 3 days later, my phone rang. And the voice on the other end said something that made my heart stop. Hello, Ingrid. This is Jonathan Mercer, the CEO. I've been expecting your application for a very long time. I froze. How could you possibly expect my application? I asked. He paused. Then he said something that made no sense at all. Because your grandmother asked me to wait for it. My grandmother had died 10 years earlier. Which meant the CEO of a billion-dollar company had been waiting for my resume. For an entire decade. For several seconds after the phone call ended, I simply stared at my phone. Jonathan Mercer, the CEO of Mercer Holdings, one of the most powerful financial firms in Chicago. And he had just told me he had been expecting my application. For 10 years. Because of my grandmother. None of it made sense. My grandmother had passed away when I was 18. At the time, I believed her business affairs had ended with her retirement years earlier. But now a billionaire CEO was claiming she had arranged something long before her death. I called the number back just to make sure it hadn't been some strange prank. Jonathan Mercer answered immediately. You called faster than I expected, he said calmly. I had to be sure this wasn't a mistake, I admitted. It's not, he replied. I meant what I said. Your grandmother asked me to look out for you. My mind struggled to connect the pieces. How could she possibly know you? I asked. There was a small pause before he answered. Your grandmother once saved my company. That statement only confused me more. Saved it how? It's a long story, he said. But if you're willing to come to Chicago, I'd prefer explaining it in person. A plane ticket arrived in my email less than 15 minutes later. First class.
Wo? Markt. 2 days later I found myself stepping out of a taxi in downtown Chicago. The Mercer Holdings headquarters towered above the street like something out of a financial magazine.
Glass walls.
Steel framework.
A massive building that seemed to reflect the entire skyline. Inside, the lobby was just as impressive. Polished marble floors stretched across the room, and employees in tailored suits moved quickly through the space. The receptionist looked up as I approached the desk. Name?
Ingrid Thornton.
She typed something into her computer and then smiled politely. Mr. Mercer is expecting you. The elevator ride to the top floor felt surreal. 2 weeks earlier, I had been sitting in my bedroom wondering how I would ever escape my father's reputation. Now I was standing inside the headquarters of a billion-dollar company. When the elevator doors opened, a tall man in a charcoal suit was already waiting. Jonathan Mercer looked older than I expected, perhaps in his late 50s. But his sharp eyes carried the kind of focus that explained why he ran such a powerful company. Ingrid, he said, extending his hand.
Welcome to Chicago.
His handshake was firm but warm.
Thank you for coming.
I followed him into a spacious office overlooking the entire city. The view stretched across the skyline like a living painting. But Jonathan Mercer wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at me. You have your grandmother's eyes, he said quietly.
The comment caught me off guard.
You knew her well? He nodded.
Better than you might think. Liebe Silverhalte, Farmer und Liesen.
Jonathan walked to a cabinet and pulled out a thin leather folder. He placed it gently on the desk between us. This is the agreement your grandmother and I made 15 years ago. My heart began beating faster. He opened the folder. Inside was a contract. At the bottom of the page was my grandmother's signature.
Margaret Hayes.
Beside it was Jonathan Mercer's. The document was dated 15 years earlier. This agreement states that if you ever applied for a position at Mercer Holdings, Jonathan explained, I would personally guarantee you an opportunity. I blinked. She planned this 15 years ago? Yes. He leaned back in his chair. Your grandmother believed you would one day need help escaping your father's influence. The accuracy of that statement left me speechless. How did she know? Jonathan smiled slightly. Margaret Hayes was one of the most perceptive people I've ever met. Then his expression turned serious. When I was younger, my company nearly collapsed. He tapped the folder lightly. Your grandmother invested the money that saved it. The words took a moment to sink in. My grandmother funded Mercer Holdings? Not entirely, he said. But without her investment, we wouldn't exist today. I stared at the contract. Why would she do that? Jonathan answered immediately. Because she believed in potential. Then he looked directly at me. Just like she believed in yours.
Nachrichtig Freude.
He slid another document across the desk. This is your official job offer. The position was listed clearly. Junior Financial Analyst, Mercer Holdings.
The salary made my eyes widen.
It was nearly double what I had expected for an entry-level role. You haven't even interviewed me, I said. Jonathan smiled. Actually, I have. I frowned. When? For the last 10 minutes. He folded his hands. Your grandmother told me something very specific when we signed that agreement. What? He quoted her words perfectly. When Ingrid finally comes to you, it means the world has already tried to break her. If she still stands after that, hire her. For the first time in years, emotion caught in my throat. My grandmother had known. She had known exactly what my father might one day do. And she had built an escape route long before I realized I needed one.
9.
I accepted the job that day. But before leaving, Jonathan Mercer said something that made me pause. You should know one more thing, he said. What is it? He opened the leather folder again and removed a small envelope. This was also part of your grandmother's instructions. He handed it to me carefully. The envelope was sealed. On the front, written in my grandmother's handwriting, were 5 simple words. Open this after you're hired. My hands trembled slightly as I turned it over.
What's inside? I asked. Jonathan shook his head.
She never told me. I stared at the envelope. Whatever my grandmother had planned clearly wasn't finished yet. And somehow I had the feeling the letter inside would explain something even more shocking. Something that could change the balance of power between my father and me forever. Because if my grandmother had been planning my future 15 years ago, then there was a very good chance she had also planned his downfall. For several minutes after leaving Jonathan Mercer's office, I just stood in the elevator holding the envelope. The paper felt older than it looked. My grandmother's handwriting on the front was unmistakable, neat, careful, and slightly slanted to the right. Open this after you're hired. She had written those words 15 years ago. 15 years before I ever imagined standing inside the headquarters of Mercer Holdings. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing. My grandmother had always been thoughtful, strategic. She rarely did anything without a reason. Which meant the letter inside this envelope had been written with purpose. I stepped outside onto the busy Chicago sidewalk and found a quiet bench across the street from the building. For a moment I simply stared at the envelope. Then I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The letter began in the same calm handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and holiday notes.
Lob's ich treu verschätzt, wo's Siegmüßigkeitsandern. Sich so musst ich's andern mutig künftigt.
Dear Ingrid, if you're reading this, it means 2 things. First, you were brave enough to leave that house. Second, Jonathan Mercer kept his promise. A lump formed in my throat. My grandmother had expected exactly this moment. She had expected the day I would finally walk away from my father's control.
Nichts uns, nichts uns.
The letter continued. Your father believes power comes from intimidation. He believes reputation can be destroyed with enough influence. Unfortunately for him, he underestimated something. He underestimated preparation. I read the next paragraph slowly, trying to understand what she meant. 15 years ago, when I invested in Mercer Holdings, I made 2 arrangements. The first arrangement was your job. The second arrangement was your future.
My heartbeat quickened.
Future? What exactly had she prepared?
Es gibt mehr, Felica.
The next lines made my hands start shaking. Along with my investment in Mercer Holdings, I created a private financial account in your name. Jonathan Mercer has the details. You were not meant to receive this money immediately. You were meant to receive it when you needed independence. I lowered the letter slightly and stared out at the street. Traffic passed. People walked by. The city moved normally around me. But my life had suddenly shifted again. I continued reading. If you are reading this, it means your father has likely tried to control your opportunities. That is exactly why this account exists. You deserve the freedom to build your life without begging for approval from anyone.
The final paragraph was short,
but it carried the weight of everything she had been protecting me from.
Remember this, Ingrid.
You were never the weak one in that house. You were simply the one they feared would eventually see the truth. Now you have,
and now you are free. With love.
Grandmother.
Diesen.
I folded the letters slowly. My emotions tangled somewhere between grief and gratitude. For years I had believed my grandmother was simply the one person in the family who understood me. But she had been doing far more than understanding. She had been planning. Planning for the moment when I might need an escape. Planning for the moment when my father's control finally pushed me out. I returned to Mercer Holdings immediately. Jonathan Mercer was waiting in his office when I walked in. You opened the letter, he said quietly. Yes. I placed it gently on the desk. She mentioned a financial account. Jonathan nodded and walked to a locked drawer. He removed a document and slid it toward me. This is the account your grandmother created. I glanced at the numbers on the page. At first they didn't make sense. Then I realized why. The amount was far larger than I expected.
750,000. My breath caught.
That can't be right, I whispered. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. Your grandmother was an extremely successful businesswoman, he said. She believed in investing early and patiently. He tapped the document lightly. This account has been growing for 15 years. I stared at the numbers again. Nearly $3 million. The same family that had made me feel like a financial burden. Had no idea my grandmother had quietly secured my independence. Jonathan studied my expression carefully. She loved you very much.
I nodded slowly.
I know. But another thought had already begun forming in my mind. For years my father had controlled the narrative. He told people I was irresponsible, dishonest,
untrustworthy.
And in a small town, those rumors had spread quickly. But now everything had changed. For the first time in my life,
I had power of my own.
And suddenly I realized something else. My father's construction company had recently announced plans for its largest project ever. A new office complex outside town. A project requiring major investment funding. Funding my father had been aggressively seeking from outside investors. I looked up at Jonathan Mercer.
Do you ever invest in construction developments?
I asked. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Occasionally. I smiled slightly. Because I think I know one project that might need a new investor. Jonathan's expression slowly turned curious.
Your father's company?
I nodded. Yes. For years Gerald Thornton had believed I was powerless. A daughter he could dismiss. A reputation he could destroy. But now the balance of power was shifting. Because very soon my father would learn something he never expected. The daughter he tried to ruin was about to become the investor capable of saving his company. Or destroying it. And which one I chose would depend entirely on how he responded when he finally realized who I had become. 3 months after moving to Chicago, I returned to my hometown for the first time. In those 3 months, my life had changed in ways I still struggled to process. I had settled into my role at Mercer Holdings. The work was challenging, but exciting. For the first time in my life, people evaluated me based on my skills rather than my last name. My colleagues didn't know my father. They didn't know the rumors that had once followed me everywhere. They only knew the work I produced. And that difference changed everything. But eventually, I knew I would have to return home. Not for closure. For truth. SEL. My father's construction company was hosting a public presentation for their new development project. The entire town had been invited. Local investors. Business owners. Even members of the city council. My father loved events like this. They allowed him to showcase his influence. To remind everyone who controlled the local economy. The presentation was being held inside the ballroom of the county conference center. When I walked in, the room buzzed with conversation. People in business suits gathered around display boards showing architectural plans for the new office complex. Marcus stood near the front of the room speaking confidently with several investors. My father stood at the center of the crowd. Exactly where he liked to be. For a moment I simply watched him. He looked exactly the same. Confident. Certain. Completely unaware of how much my life had changed. Then someone noticed me. The whispers began immediately. Ingrid? I thought she moved away. Isn't she the one who? The same rumors my father had planted years earlier. I heard them clearly. But this time they didn't sting. Because today I wasn't here as the girl whose reputation had been destroyed. I was here as something very different. Liege. My father noticed me a few seconds later. His smile vanished instantly. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly. "I came to see your presentation," I said calmly. He crossed his arms. "This is a private investor event." "Exactly." The room slowly quieted as people sensed the tension. Marcus walked over. "Ingrid," he said carefully, "this isn't the place for—" "I'm not here to argue," I interrupted. "I'm here for business." My father laughed sharply. "Business?" He looked around at the guests. "This should be interesting." I reached into my bag and removed a folder. The same folder Jonathan Mercer had given me before I left Chicago. Inside were official documents. Investment Authorization. Financial backing. Mercer Holdings letterhead. I handed the folder to my father. "You've been looking for a primary investor for this project," I said. He opened the folder slowly. At first, confusion crossed his face. Then, disbelief. Finally, something close to panic. The room was completely silent now. Everyone watched as Gerald Thornton read the document. This can't be real," he muttered. But it was. Mercer Holdings had officially agreed to invest in the project, and I had been assigned as the firm's representative, which meant the final approval belonged to me.
Anstehen.
My father looked up slowly. "You?" he said. "Yes." Marcus grabbed the folder and scanned the pages quickly. "Mercer Holdings?" he said. His voice sounded stunned. "They're backing the entire development." I nodded. "And I'm the analyst responsible for evaluating the project." For the first time in my life, my father looked uncertain. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked. "You can call Jonathan Mercer if you'd like," I replied calmly.
The name alone sent murmurs through the crowd.
Everyone in the room knew Mercer Holdings, and everyone knew their investments were powerful enough to transform a company overnight. My father's construction project depended entirely on securing the right financial backing. Without it, the development would collapse before it even began. And now that backing sat in my hands.
Wer dir es gehört ist ein Genehm.
For several seconds, no one spoke. Then my father asked the question he never expected to ask.
"What do you want?" The room grew even quieter.
For years he had spoken to me like I had nothing to offer. Now he was asking what I wanted. I looked around the room. The same town where my reputation had been destroyed. The same business owners who had quietly believed my father's accusations. Then I looked back at him. "I want the truth," I said. His expression tightened. "What truth?" I took a breath. "You told everyone I stole from you. You told every employer in this town that I was dishonest."
The silence in the ballroom felt heavy.
"You destroyed my career before it even began." My father shifted uncomfortably. "That was years ago," he said. "People move on."
I shook my head.
"Not from lies." Marcus looked down at the floor. Several people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. My father cleared his throat. "What exactly are you asking for?" I met his eyes directly. "A public apology." The words echoed through the room. "To me," I said. "And to Mom." His face hardened. "You expect me to embarrass myself in front of everyone here?" I held his gaze calmly. "You embarrassed me for 2 years." The folder remained in his hands. Inside it sat the future of his company. He knew it. And so did everyone else. For the first time in his life, Gerald Thornton understood something he had never experienced before. He no longer controlled the situation.
Ah.
The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then my father slowly turned toward the crowd. His voice sounded different when he finally spoke. Lower. Less certain. "I may have been mistaken about my daughter," he said stiffly. "That's not an apology," I replied. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something had changed. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I allowed my pride to damage my daughter's reputation." The words sounded painful, but they were real. And for the first time in years, the truth had been spoken out loud.
Ich wage Trojan. I nodded slowly.
Then I took the folder back. The investment will move forward, I said.
Relief spread across my father's face.
But before he could speak, I added one final sentence. With one condition. He stiffened again. Your company hires 3 new junior accountants this year. Marcus frowned. Why? I smiled slightly. Because somewhere in this town there are young graduates looking for their first opportunity. I paused. And no one should lose that opportunity because of someone else's pride.
Esslingtone?
6 months later, construction on the new office complex began. The investment proved successful. My father's company expanded. Marcus eventually joined Mercer Holdings' regional partnerships team. And I continued building my career in Chicago. But the most important change wasn't professional. It was personal. For the first time in my life, my father no longer saw me as someone to control. He saw me as someone he had underestimated. And that realization changed our relationship forever. Because the daughter he tried to ruin turned out to be the one person capable of saving everything he had built.